An orphan shared her lunch with a beggar. He turned out to be the school's secret benefactor. This simple act of kindness on a bitter November morning would change 12-year-old Ellie Morgan's life forever, though she couldn't have known it as she shivered at the school gates, clutching her worn backpack against the wind. Maple Grove Academy stood imposing against the gray sky, its brick facade darkened by morning rain. For most students, it represented opportunity and privilege. For Ellie, it was both salvation and daily torment. The scholarship that had brought her here after her parents' death 3 years ago was her ticket to a future beyond the state home where she now lived, but it did little to shield her from the whispers that followed her through the hallowed halls. "Charity case," the whispers said. "Foster freak." Ellie kept her eyes down as she climbed the steps, her second-hand uniform hanging slightly too large on her small frame. Her stomach growled painfully. She'd missed breakfast again, having overslept after another night of restless dreams where she still called out for parents who would never answer. The lunch she carried, a simple sandwich and apple she'd saved from yesterday's dinner, would need to sustain her until evening. She slipped into her first class just as the bell rang, sliding into her seat at the back corner. Nobody noticed, nobody ever did, except for Ms. Abernathy, her literature teacher, whose kind eyes softened whenever they landed on Ellie. But even Ms. Abernathy's kindness couldn't erase the essential truth of Ellie's existence. She was alone in the world. "We'll be pairing up for this semester's literary analysis project," Ms. Abernathy announced, and Ellie's heart sank. Group projects were exercises in humiliation, watching as students scrambled to pair with friends while she stood awkwardly until someone was forced to work with her. When the inevitable happened, Ellie standing alone as the others formed their pairs, Ms. Abernathy gently said, "Ellie, would you mind working independently? I think you're more than capable." A special assignment, another way of saying no one wanted her. "Yes, Ms. Abernathy," she replied quietly, ignoring the burning behind her eyes. By lunchtime, the hollow feeling in Ellie's stomach had grown painful. She unwrapped her sandwich at a corner table in the cafeteria, away from the clusters of chattering students. Half a peanut butter sandwich and 1 red apple. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, knowing there would be nothing else until dinner at the home. Through the large windows, she noticed a figure huddled on a bench in the school garden. An old man, it seemed, with stooped shoulders and a threadbare coat. He sat perfectly still, watching the school with a strange intensity that made Ellie curious. Most adults avoided loitering near schools these days, but there was something in his posture, a familiar loneliness, that resonated with something deep inside her. Without fully understanding why, Ellie wrapped the remaining half of her sandwich. She slipped her apple into her pocket and made her way out through the side door, crossing the garden with hesitant steps. Up close, the man looked even more worn than his coat. Deep lines etched his weathered face, and his gray beard was untrimmed. But his eyes, a startling clear blue, held a sharp intelligence that caught Ellie by surprise. "You shouldn't be out in the cold, sir," she said, her voice barely audible above the wind that whipped between them. "Would you like half my sandwich?" The man's eyebrows rose slightly, those clear eyes studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away. But Ellie had learned long ago that showing weakness only invited more pain, so she held his gaze. "Why would you give away your lunch, young lady?" he asked, his voice surprisingly refined despite his appearance. "You look like you need it yourself." Ellie's fingers tightened around the sandwich. "I had enough," she lied. "And you looked cold." A strange smile crossed his face. "What's your name?" "Ellie. Ellie Morgan." "Well, Ellie Morgan, I'd be honored to share your lunch." He accepted the sandwich half with surprisingly clean hands. "Would you sit with me a moment?" She hesitated, glancing back at the school. Lunch period still had 15 minutes left. "Just for a minute?" she decided, perching on the far end of the bench. They ate in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. There was something peaceful about sitting with someone who expected nothing from her. No conversation, no explanation of why she was at this prestigious school, despite clearly not belonging. "Do you like it here?" the man asked eventually, nodding toward the school. Ellie considered lying, but something about those clear blue eyes made her think he'd see right through it. "The classes are good," she said carefully. "I like learning, but it's hard to learn when you don't belong." The words slipped out before she could stop them, and Ellie immediately wished she could take them back. The last thing she needed was for word to get back to the scholarship committee that she was ungrateful. The man nodded slowly. "And why do you think you don't belong?" Ellie tugged at her worn sleeve self-consciously. Everyone knows I'm here on charity. I live at Greenwood Home for Children. I don't have," she swallowed hard, "parents anymore." Something flashed in the man's eyes, pain or recognition she couldn't tell. "I see," he said softly. "And the other students, they're unkind?" "Some are," Ellie admitted, surprised at how easily she was confiding in this stranger. "Most just pretend I don't exist." He took a bite of the sandwich, chewing thoughtfully. "Sometimes invisibility can be a gift, you know. You see things others miss." The bell rang in the distance, signaling the end of lunch. Ellie stood quickly, suddenly aware of how strange this conversation might appear to anyone watching. "I have to go." "Of course." The man nodded. "Thank you for the sandwich, Ellie Morgan. And for the company." She hesitated, then reached into her pocket and placed the apple on the bench beside him. "It's getting colder. You should find somewhere warm." As she hurried back toward the school, she felt his eyes following her, and when she glanced back from the doorway, he raised his hand in a small wave. That afternoon, for the first time in months, Ellie found herself thinking about something other than her own loneliness. Who was the man in the garden? Why did he watch the school? His clothes were worn but clean, his speech educated. He didn't smell of alcohol like some of the homeless men who sometimes lingered near the children's home. She was so distracted that she bumped directly into Aiden Phillips, son of the school board president and her most dedicated tormentor. "Watch it, charity case," he sneered, shoving her backward hard enough that she stumbled into the lockers. Ellie bit her lip against the pain where her shoulder had slammed metal. "Sorry," she muttered automatically, though it hadn't been her fault. "Sorry doesn't fix stupid," Aiden replied, his friends snickering behind him. He spotted her backpack, which had fallen open, revealing her battered notebook. "What's this?" "Your diary of sad orphan thoughts?" Before she could react, he snatched it up, flipping through pages where Ellie had carefully drawn imaginary places, fantastical landscapes where she escaped in her mind during the hardest nights at the home. "Give it back," she said, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. Those drawings were private, personal, the only thing that was truly hers. "Make me," Aiden taunted, holding it above his head, well out of her reach. Ellie was about to lunge for it when a sharp voice cut through the hallway. "Mr. Phillips." Ms. Abernathy approached, her expression thunderous. "Return Ms. Morgan's property immediately?" Aiden's smile vanished, replaced by the perfect mask of contrition he reserved for adults. "We were just joking around, Miss Abernathy. Right, Ellie?" The teacher's eyes narrowed. "The notebook, Mr. Phillips. Now." He handed it over with exaggerated politeness, then shot Ellie a look that promised retribution later. As the group skulked away, Ms. Abernathy passed the notebook back to Ellie. "Are you all right?" she asked quietly. Ellie nodded, clutching the notebook to her chest. "I'm fine. Thank you, Ms. Abernathy's eyes were kind but worried. "Ellie, if students are bothering you, you should report it. It would only make things worse," she replied truthfully. The teacher sighed, clearly knowing this was probably true. "Well, my classroom is always open if you need a quiet place at lunch or after school." Ellie managed a small smile. "Thank you." That night at Greenwood Home, Ellie lay on her narrow bed in the room she shared with 3 other girls, staring at the ceiling as rain pattered against the window. She'd skipped dinner, claiming illness after discovering that the pocket where she kept her lunch money had been torn open. Aiden's revenge, no doubt. But strangely, it wasn't hunger or Aiden that occupied her thoughts. It was the man in the garden, with his weathered face and clear eyes. There had been something familiar about him, something she couldn't quite place. And his question echoed in her mind. Why would you give away your lunch? The truth was, Ellie didn't fully know herself. Perhaps it was simply recognition, one invisible person seeing another. Or maybe it was the memory of her father's voice. "Kindness costs nothing, Ellie Bear, but its value is beyond measure." Her father would have shared his lunch. Her mother would have sat and listened. So Ellie had done what they would have wanted, even if they weren't here to see it. With that thought warming her despite her empty stomach, she finally drifted to sleep. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Ellie arrived at school early, as she often did to avoid the crowded buses. To her surprise, Ms. Abernathy was waiting at her classroom door. "Ellie, could I speak with you a moment?" the teacher asked. Anxiety immediately flooded her. Had Aiden's parents complained? Was her scholarship in jeopardy? "It's nothing to worry about, Ms. Abernathy added quickly, noting her expression. "Actually, it's good news. The Academy Foundation has selected you for their special mentorship program." Ellie blinked in confusion. Mentorship program? It's quite an honor, Ms. Abernathy explained, ushering her into the empty classroom. Only 2 students are chosen each year. You'll meet weekly with one of the Foundation's representatives for additional academic guidance, college planning, and career mentoring. But why me? The question slipped out before Ellie could stop it. Ms. Abernathy smiled gently. Because you have tremendous potential, Ellie. Your grades are excellent despite challenging circumstances. She paused. Your first meeting is today after school, in the library conference room. I'll take you there myself. Throughout the day, Ellie's thoughts swirled with questions. The Academy Foundation was the mysterious organization that funded scholarships, building improvements, and special programs at Maple Grove. Nobody seemed to know much about its founder or board members, only that their generosity had transformed the once struggling school into one of the finest in the state. And now they wanted to mentor her? It didn't make sense. She was so distracted that she forgot to look for the man in the garden during lunch. It was only as she left the cafeteria that she remembered, quickly glancing out the windows. The bench stood empty, and an unexpected disappointment tugged at her heart. When the final bell rang, Ms. Abernathy escorted her to the library's small conference room. Your mentor will be here shortly, she said with an encouraging smile. Just be yourself, Ellie. This is a wonderful opportunity. Left alone, Ellie nervously straightened her uniform, wishing she could somehow make it look less second-hand. The conference room, with its polished wooden table and leather chairs, made her acutely aware of every frayed thread and scuffed shoe. She nearly jumped out of her skin when the door opened behind her. Turning, the greeting she'd prepared died on her lips. Standing in the doorway, now dressed in an impeccable charcoal suit instead of a threadbare coat, was the man from the garden. Hello again, Ellie Morgan, he said, those clear blue eyes crinkling at the corners. It seems we have more to discuss than just sharing sandwiches. For several long seconds, Ellie could only stare. The transformation was remarkable. Without the stooped posture and ragged coat, the man stood tall and distinguished, silver hair neatly combed, beard trimmed. Yet the eyes were unmistakable, the same ones that had studied her with such intensity on the garden bench. You, she finally managed. You're not a beggar? He smiled, moving to take a seat across from her. No, not in the traditional sense, though I do consider myself a seeker of sorts. My name is Robert Harrington. The name struck Ellie like a physical blow. Everyone at Maple Grove knew that name. It adorned the plaque in the entrance hall, the new science wing, and the scholarship certificates awarded at each year's ceremony. You're the Robert Harrington? Her voice came out barely above a whisper. The founder of the Academy Foundation? He nodded, watching her reaction with those perceptive eyes. I am. Though I prefer to evaluate the impact of my contributions personally, without the, he gestured vaguely, fanfare that tends to accompany the Harrington name. Ellie's mind raced, connecting pieces. That's why you were watching the school. You were, what? Testing me? Something flashed across his face. Regret, perhaps. Not testing, observing. There's a significant difference. He leaned forward slightly. I spend time on that bench several days each month, watching how students interact, how they treat each other and those they perceive as less fortunate. It tells me far more about the school's true culture than any report or academic ranking. And I happen to be the one who noticed you, Ellie said slowly, understanding dawning. You were the only one in 3 years who has offered to share their lunch, he corrected gently. But more importantly, you did so when you clearly had little to spare yourself. Heat rushed to Ellie's cheeks, embarrassment mingled with something else she couldn't name. I didn't do it to get anything in return. Precisely why it mattered, Mr. Harrington smiled. True kindness expects no reward. He opened a leather portfolio she hadn't noticed him carrying. Now about this mentorship. It's real, by the way, not something I invented after meeting you. But I did personally select you after our encounter yesterday. Typically, we choose students who show academic promise but need additional support systems. Your situation seemed to fit those criteria. Ellie's hands twisted in her lap. Because I'm an orphan. Because you're resilient, intelligent, and kind despite circumstances that might have hardened someone else. He regarded her steadily. Tell me, Ellie, what do you want from your education here? The directness of the question caught her off guard. Adults usually told her what she should want. Good grades, college acceptance, a way out of the system. Nobody had asked what she herself desired. I want ... she began, then paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound ungrateful. I want to belong somewhere again. she finally admitted. To learn enough that I can make a life where I'm not always an outsider, where I can help other kids who feel like they don't matter. Something softened in Mr. Harrington's expression. An admirable goal, and more honest than most, I hear. He made a brief note. The mentorship program includes weekly meetings, academic resources, cultural experiences, and eventually college and career guidance. I typically don't mentor students personally, but in your case, I'd like to make an exception, if you're comfortable with that arrangement. Ellie's thoughts whirled. The man who funded her entire education wanted to mentor her personally? It seemed impossible, yet he sat before her, waiting patiently for her answer. Why me? She asked again, unable to stop herself. Really? Mr. Harrington was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had lost some of its polished precision. Because 45 years ago, I was you, Ellie. An orphan on scholarship at a school where I didn't belong, hungry more often than not. His gaze drifted briefly to the window. Except no one offered to share their lunch with me. The revelation hung in the air between them, changing the dynamic of the room entirely. Ellie studied him with new eyes, seeing past the expensive suit to the boy he must have been. Alone, adrift, determined. What happened to your parents? She asked softly. Car accident. I was 10. The words were simple but laden with a grief that time had tempered but never erased, a grief Ellie recognized intimately. I bounced between foster homes until graduation, then worked my way through college and eventually built Harrington Technologies. He refocused on her, his expression open in a way it hadn't been before. Your act of kindness yesterday? It reminded me why I started the foundation in the first place. Not just to provide opportunities, but to see the students who feel invisible. Ellie swallowed hard against the tightness in her throat. I would be honored to have you as my mentor, Mr. Harrington. Good. He smiled, and for just a moment, she could see traces of the boy he'd been. We'll start next week. In the meantime, he reached into his portfolio and produced an envelope. This is for you. She accepted it cautiously. What is it? Open it. Inside was a new student ID card, a small silver key, and a letter on Academy Foundation letterhead. Ellie skimmed the formal language, her eyes widening. An apartment? She whispered, looking up in disbelief. For me? The foundation maintains several small apartments near campus for scholarship students with special circumstances, Mr. Harrington explained. I've arranged for you to have one, with proper supervision, of course. The state has already approved the arrangement, as it falls under our educational guardianship program. Ellie stared at the key in her palm, small and silver and impossibly significant. I don't have to go back to Greenwood? Not unless you want to. His voice was gentle. The apartment isn't charity, Ellie. It's an investment in your education. Students who don't have to worry about basic security tend to perform better academically. Tears pricked her eyes, and Ellie blinked them back fiercely. Thank you, she managed, her voice barely steady. I don't know what else to say. You can thank me by exceeding your own expectations, not mine. Mr. Harrington gathered his papers. Ms. Abernathy will take you to see the apartment after our meeting. It's furnished, but somewhat minimally. Part of your monthly stipend can be used for personal items. Monthly stipend? Ellie felt increasingly overwhelmed. For food, clothing, school supplies, and reasonable personal expenses. All outlined in the letter. He closed his portfolio. One more thing, Ellie. I'd appreciate if you kept our initial meeting between us. My role at the school is something I prefer to keep. Understated. She nodded, understanding. I won't tell anyone you were the man on the bench. Thank you. He stood, extending his hand formally. Until next week, then. Ellie shook his hand, still dazed by how drastically her life had changed in the span of 24 hours, all because she'd shared half a sandwich with a stranger. As Mr. Harrington reached the door, she found her voice again. Sir? The apple was for you, too. I just wanted you to know that. He paused, his back to her for a moment. When he turned, there was something in his eyes she couldn't quite read. I know, Ellie. That's precisely why we're here now. The apartment was small but perfect. A studio with a kitchenette, private bathroom, and a bank of windows that filled the space with afternoon light. Located in a converted carriage house behind one of the school's administrative buildings, it offered both privacy and proximity to campus. Ms. Abernathy helped her settle in, explaining that Mrs. Chen, the kind-faced woman who managed the administrative building, lived in the main house and would serve as her adult supervisor. The refrigerator and cupboards had been stocked with basic foods, and a new backpack filled with school supplies sat on the small desk. Mr. Harrington moves quickly when he makes a decision. Ms. Abernathy remarked, watching Ellie explore the space with wonder. I've never seen the Foundation process guardianship papers so efficiently. Ellie ran her fingers along the simple bookshelf, already imagining it filled. Does he choose all the scholarship students himself? The Foundation has a committee, Ms. Abernathy replied carefully. But Mr. Harrington takes a special interest in cases like yours. Cases like mine? The teacher's expression softened. Students with exceptional potential who faced exceptional challenges. After Ms. Abernathy left, Ellie sat on the edge of the bed, her bed in her apartment, and tried to process everything that had happened. Yesterday she'd been an invisible orphan surviving day to day. Today she had a home, a mentor, and for the first time in 3 years, a sense that someone saw her, truly saw her. And it had all begun with half a sandwich. Over the next few weeks, Ellie's life transformed in ways she could never have imagined. The apartment became her sanctuary, a place where she could study without the constant noise and interruptions of the children's home, where she could sleep without fear of her few possessions disappearing, where she could simply exist without constantly being reminded of everything she'd lost. Her weekly meetings with Mr. Harrington became the anchors around which her days revolved. Unlike the distant authority figures who had managed her case since her parents' death, he spoke to her as though her thoughts mattered, challenging her academically but showing genuine interest in her as a person. Education isn't just about absorbing information, he told her during their 3rd session as they discussed her literature assignment. It's about learning to think critically, to question, to form your own perspectives, even when they're different from what the teacher expects. Ellie asked, thinking of her recent essay where she'd argued against the conventional interpretation of the assigned novel. Especially then, Mr. Harrington replied with a smile, provided you can defend your position thoughtfully. As October gave way to November, subtle changes began to manifest in Ellie's school experience. Regular meals and restful sleep improved her concentration. The security of having her own space reduced her constant anxiety. And Mr. Harrington's mentorship bolstered her confidence in the classroom. But the most surprising change came in her social interactions. Without the visible markers of her status as a home kid, the rushed appearance, the empty stomach, the perpetual exhaustion, her classmates began to see her differently, not as someone to pity or mock, but simply as Ellie. It started small. Casey Wilson, a quiet girl from her mathematics class, asked if they could study together for a test. 2 boys from Science Lab requested her as a partner after she aced the previous experiment. Even Madison Taylor, one of the school's most popular girls, smiled at her in the hallway after Ellie helped her retrieve a dropped notebook. Only Aiden Phillips maintained his hostility, though even he seemed uncertain how to target someone who no longer flinched at his approach. "Still a charity case?" he muttered one day, intentionally bumping her shoulder as they passed in the cafeteria. "Fancy clothes can't change that." Ellie straightened the collar of her new uniform, purchased with her stipend, and met his gaze steadily. "No, they can't," she agreed calmly. "Just like your expensive shoes can't fix your insecurity." She walked away before he could respond, heart pounding but head high. Behind her, she heard a few surprised laughs from witnesses to the exchange. That afternoon in her mentorship meeting, Ellie recounted the interaction to Mr. Harrington, half expecting a reprimand for talking back to another student. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, eyes crinkling with amusement. "Well said, though perhaps with room for diplomatic improvement. He's been awful to me since my first day," Ellie explained, "always calling me charity case or foster freak." Something darkened in Mr. Harrington's expression. "Has he indeed? It doesn't bother me as much anymore," she added quickly, not wanting to seem like she was complaining. "I understand better now that his behavior says more about him than about me." A wise perspective. Mr. Harrington studied her thoughtfully. "You know, Ellie, there's something liberating about understanding that other people's opinions don't define your worth. Is that how you felt when you were my age?" He smiled slightly. "Actually, at your age, I was still very much defined by what others thought of me. It took me considerably longer to learn that lesson." As their session concluded, Mr. Harrington handed her a small wrapped package. "A little early for Christmas, but I thought you might appreciate this now." Inside was a beautiful leather-bound sketchbook and a set of artist-quality colored pencils. Ellie looked up in surprise. "Ms. Abernathy mentioned your drawings," he explained. "Talent should be nurtured, not just academic aptitude." Ellie ran her fingers over the smooth cover, speechless with gratitude. "Thank you." she finally managed. "I've never had real art supplies before. Consider it an investment in your creative development," he replied with a gentle smile. "Now I believe you have a history paper to complete?" As Thanksgiving approached, Ellie found herself dreading the holiday for the first time since her parents' death. Previous years at Greenwood had been marked by institutional attempts at festivity, donated turkeys, volunteer servers, and the painful awareness that everyone was trying too hard to compensate for what was missing: family. But now, with her own space and growing sense of independence, the prospect of returning to Greenwood for the 4-day weekend felt like a step backward. "What typically happens during school breaks?" Mr. Harrington asked during their pre-Thanksgiving meeting. Ellie shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant. "I go back to Greenwood. It's not so bad. They try to make it special." He regarded her thoughtfully. "And if you had a choice?" "I'd stay here," she admitted. "But Mrs. Chen is visiting her daughter in Chicago, so there wouldn't be anyone to supervise." Mr. Harrington made a note in his ever-present portfolio. "I may have an alternative. Give me a day to make arrangements." The alternative, as it turned out, was an invitation to Thanksgiving dinner at Ms. Abernathy's home, with approval from both the Foundation and Greenwood's director for Ellie to spend the holiday weekend there. "Mr. Harrington thought you might prefer this to returning to the group home," Ms. Abernathy explained when she extended the invitation. "And frankly, I'd love the company. It's usually just me and my sister's family." Thanksgiving at Ms. Abernathy's modest but warm home was everything the holiday should be. Good food, genuine laughter, and not a single moment where Ellie felt like a charity project. Ms. Abernathy's sister had 2 children close to Ellie's age, who included her in their post-dinner games without hesitation, and by the time the weekend ended, Ellie had experienced something she'd nearly forgotten: the simple comfort of belonging. "Thank you for arranging that," she told Mr. Harrington at their next meeting. "It was the best Thanksgiving I've had since—" She trailed off, the comparison hanging unspoken between them. "Since your parents," he finished softly. "You don't have to avoid mentioning them, Ellie. Loss isn't something to be hidden away like a shameful secret. Sometimes it feels easier not to talk about them," she admitted. "People get uncomfortable, or they say things like they're in a better place, or at least you had them for 9 years. "Ah yes, the well-intentioned platitudes," he nodded in understanding. "Tell me about them, your parents, if you'd like to." No adult had asked Ellie about her parents in years. Caseworkers focused on her current needs, teachers avoided the topic, and at Greenwood, the unspoken rule was to look forward, not back. The invitation to remember them openly was both painful and precious. "My dad was a high school English teacher," she began hesitantly. "He read to me every night, all the classics but with funny voices for each character. And my mom was an ER nurse. She had this amazing ability to make people feel safe, even in their worst moments." The memories flowed more easily as she continued, describing Sunday morning pancakes shaped like animals, camping trips where her father pointed out constellations, her mother teaching her to braid hair and fold origami cranes. Mr. Harrington listened attentively, asking occasional questions that showed he was truly engaged with her memories. When she finally fell silent, he said simply, "They sound like remarkable people who raised a remarkable daughter." "I miss them every day," Ellie whispered, the familiar ache in her chest both sharp and somehow comforting, a pain that connected her to love. "That never stops," Mr. Harrington said gently. "But eventually, the missing becomes part of who you are, rather than something that defines your every moment." As Christmas approached, the atmosphere at Maple Grove shifted toward festive excitement. Holiday decorations appeared in hallways, teachers incorporated seasonal themes into lessons, and conversations revolved around vacation plans and anticipated gifts. For the first time, Ellie found herself included in these conversations. Casey Wilson invited her to a cookie decorating party. Mrs. Chen helped her select and decorate a small tree for her apartment. Even Mr. Harrington's mentorship sessions took on a lighter tone, occasionally veering from academics into discussions of holiday traditions and winter activities. During their last meeting before winter break, he surprised her with concert tickets. "The symphony's Christmas performance," he explained as she examined the envelope containing 2 premier seats. "I thought perhaps you and Ms. Abernathy might enjoy it." "I've never been to the symphony," Ellie admitted, both excited and slightly intimidated by the prospect. "Then it's about time," he smiled. "Cultural experiences are as important as academic ones." As they concluded their session, Mr. Harrington handed her another package, larger than the sketchbook had been. "This one actually is for Christmas. You can open it now or wait, your choice." Ellie hesitated only briefly before carefully unwrapping the gift. Inside was a beautiful winter coat, deep blue wool with a soft lining, exactly her size. "I noticed your current coat is a bit thin for our winters," Mr. Harrington said matter-of-factly, as if the gift were merely practical rather than the most beautiful piece of clothing Ellie had ever owned. "It's perfect," she whispered, running her fingers over the soft material. "Thank you. You're quite welcome." He gathered his papers, then paused. "Oh, and Ms. Morgan? I've arranged for your stipend to include a holiday bonus. Perhaps you might want to get a small gift for Ms. Abernathy or Mrs. Chen." The thoughtfulness of the suggestion, the assumption that Ellie would want to give as well as receive, touched her deeply. "I'd like that." "Excellent. Enjoy your winter break, Ellie. I look forward to continuing our work in January." As he turned to leave, Ellie reached into her backpack and pulled out a small, carefully wrapped package. "This is for you, sir. It's not much, but Mr. Harrington accepted the gift with visible surprise. "May I?" At her nod, he unwrapped it to reveal a sketch she'd done in her new art book, a detailed drawing of the garden bench where they'd first met, with two figures sharing lunch. "I wanted you to have something to remember that day," she explained nervously, "since it changed everything for me." Mr. Harrington studied the drawing silently for a long moment. When he finally looked up, his eyes held an emotion Ellie couldn't quite define. "Thank you, Ellie," he said softly. "This means more than you know." The winter concert was magical, the symphony hall glittering with thousands of lights, the music soaring through the cavernous space. Ms. Abernathy explaining the different instruments during intermission. Ellie sat transfixed, her new coat folded neatly across her lap, absorbing every note and sensation. "Mr. Harrington has excellent taste in cultural experiences," Ms. Abernathy remarked as they left the hall. "Though I'm not surprised. He's quite the patron of the arts." "He doesn't talk much about himself," Ellie observed. "Even though he knows almost everything about me." Ms. Abernathy smiled knowingly. "Some people prefer to listen rather than speak. But I've known Robert Harrington for over a decade, and I can tell you he's one of the most genuinely compassionate people I've ever met, though he works very hard to maintain his reputation as a shrewd businessman." "Did you know he was an orphan too?" Ellie asked impulsively, then immediately worried she'd betrayed a confidence. "But Ms. Abernathy merely nodded. "Yes, though it's not something he discusses publicly. I suspect it's why he takes such a personal interest in students from similar backgrounds." The rest of winter break passed peacefully. Ellie split her time between her apartment, where she read voraciously and practiced her drawing, and various outings arranged by the Foundation for Scholarship students remaining on campus, a theater performance, a museum visit, even a day trip to a nearby snow-tubing hill. By the time classes resumed in January, Ellie felt rested and motivated in a way she couldn't remember feeling before. The girl who had once tried desperately to be invisible now raised her hand in class, joined study groups in the library, and even signed up for the school's spring art exhibition. As winter grudgingly gave way to early spring, something else began to change as well: Mr. Harrington's health. At first, the signs were subtle: occasional coughing during their sessions, a slight pallor beneath his weathered complexion, sessions that ended earlier than usual because he seemed tired. "Are you feeling all right, sir?" Ellie finally asked one afternoon in late March, when a coughing fit interrupted their discussion of college prerequisites. "Just a stubborn cold," he assured her, though his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Nothing to concern yourself with." But the following week, their session was canceled, with a message that Mr. Harrington was unavailable. The week after that, a foundation administrator named Dr. Phillips, Aiden's mother, Ellie realized with a sinking feeling, conducted the mentorship meeting instead. "Mr. Harrington sends his regrets," Dr. Phillips explained coolly. "He's attending to some health matters and has asked me to temporarily oversee your mentorship program." "Is he going to be okay?" Ellie asked, trying to mask her worry. "Doctor?" Phillips's expression remained detached. "I'm not at liberty to discuss Mr. Harrington's personal matters. Now, regarding your academic progress this semester." The session was efficient but sterile, focused exclusively on grades and requirements with none of the personal connection that had characterized her meetings with Mr. Harrington. When it ended, Dr. Phillips closed her laptop with an air of finality. I'll be conducting next week's session as well. Mr. Harrington will inform us when he's ready to resume his duties." As April arrived with its capricious weather and looming final exams, Ellie grew increasingly concerned about Mr. Harrington. 3 weeks had passed with no word from him, and Dr. Phillips remained tight-lipped about his condition or whereabouts. During an art class held in the Harrington wing, Ellie noticed a small plaque she'd overlooked before, a dedication that read, "In memory of Elizabeth Harrington, whose love of learning lives on in these halls." "Who was Elizabeth Harrington?" she asked Ms. Abernathy later that day. The teacher's expression softened. "Robert Harrington's wife. She passed away from cancer about 15 years ago. They never had children. Medical complications, I believe. The school became their legacy instead." The information added another dimension to Ellie's understanding of her mentor, another loss he had endured, another reason, perhaps, for his dedication to helping others. That evening she made a decision. Taking out her sketchbook, she began a new drawing, Mr. Harrington as she'd first seen him, sitting on the garden bench, but surrounded by elements representing their months of mentorship, books they'd discussed, the symphony hall, a Thanksgiving turkey, the winter coat. She worked for hours, pouring into the image all her gratitude and concern. The next day she approached Dr. Phillips after their brief impersonal session. "Could you give this to Mr. Harrington, please?" She held out the carefully folded drawing, protected in a large envelope. "It's just to wish him well." Dr. Phillips regarded the envelope with visible reluctance. "I'm not a messenger service, Ms. Morgan." "Please," Ellie persisted. "It's important." Something in her tone must have conveyed her sincerity, because Dr. Phillips finally took the envelope with a sigh. "I'll see that he receives it." No promises on when. A week passed with no response, then another. The spring art exhibition came and went, with Ellie's landscape series receiving an honorable mention. Final exam preparations intensified, and the school buzzed with anticipation of summer vacation. And still, no word from Mr. Harrington. Then, on a warm May afternoon, as Ellie sat sketching in the garden, on the very bench where it had all begun, a familiar voice spoke behind her. "You've captured the light beautifully." She whirled around to find Mr. Harrington standing there. He looked thinner, his suit hanging a bit loose on his frame, but his eyes were as clear and penetrating as ever. "Mr. Harrington!" Ellie jumped up, nearly dropping her sketchbook in surprise. "You're back!" In a manner of speaking, he replied with a small smile. "May I?" He gestured to the bench. They sat side by side, a mirror image of their first meeting, though the roles had somehow shifted. Ellie now confident in her place, Mr. Harrington slightly diminished by whatever illness had claimed his attention. "I received your drawing," he said after a moment. "It was thoughtful of you to send it. Are you okay?" The question burst from her, containing weeks of worry. Mr. Harrington considered her for a long moment. "I'm better than I was," he said carefully, "though not as well as I'd like to be." "What happened?" He sighed, gazing out across the garden where spring flowers nodded in the breeze. "The short answer is pneumonia, complicated by some pre-existing conditions. The longer answer," he paused, "well, that's partly why I wanted to see you today." A knot of anxiety formed in Ellie's stomach. "Are they ending my mentorship?" "No, nothing like that." He turned to face her fully. "Ellie, the Foundation's support of your education will continue uninterrupted through college, regardless of my personal involvement. But I wanted to discuss the possibility of altering our mentorship arrangement." "You don't want to be my mentor anymore?" The hurt in her voice was impossible to disguise. "On the contrary, I'd like to offer something more permanent." He held her gaze steadily. "Ellie, would you consider allowing me to become your legal guardian?" The question hung in the air between them, so unexpected that Ellie wasn't sure she'd heard correctly. "My guardian?" she repeated. "But why?" "Several reasons." Mr. Harrington's voice was gentle but matter-of-fact. "First, it would provide you with more stability than the Foundation's educational guardianship program, which technically expires when you turn 18. Second, it would simplify many aspects of your life, healthcare decisions, travel permissions, even college applications." He paused, his expression softening. "But most importantly, because these past 6 months have shown me what an extraordinary young woman you are, and I would consider it a privilege to provide you with the home and family support you deserve." Ellie struggled to process his words. "But you're Robert Harrington. You run a huge foundation and a technology company. Why would you want to be responsible for a 12-year-old girl?" Because this 12-year-old girl shared her lunch with a stranger when she had barely enough for herself. His voice roughened slightly. Because she sees the world with compassion and clarity beyond her years. Because in many ways, she reminds me of the person I wish I'd had the courage to be at her age. What would it mean? You being my guardian? It would mean you'd live with me during school breaks and summers in my home rather than the apartment. You'd have your own room, of course, and considerable freedom appropriate to your age and maturity. He spoke carefully, as if he'd given this significant thought. During the school year, you could choose whether to remain in the apartment or stay with me, whichever you prefer. Your day-to-day life at Maple Grove wouldn't change significantly. Ellie tried to imagine it, having a real home again, someone legally responsible for her welfare who actually knew her, cared about her as an individual. What about when you travel for business? She asked practically. I have excellent household staff, and I've already reduced my travel commitments considerably due to health concerns. He smiled slightly. I'm not proposing this without having considered the logistics, Ellie. And Greenwood? The state? I've already had preliminary discussions with your caseworker. Given my relationship with you through the foundation, my financial stability, and your expressed preference, they're cautiously supportive, pending your agreement, of course, and the usual home studies and legal requirements. The thoroughness of his planning told Ellie this wasn't a spontaneous offer, but something he'd been considering for some time. Can I think about it? She asked quietly. Of course. He reached into his pocket and handed her a business card with an address handwritten on the back. This is my home. Perhaps you might like to see it this weekend before you decide, Ms. Abernathy could accompany you. As Mr. Harrington stood to leave, Ellie had one more question. Sir? That day in the garden, did you choose that bench because you knew students would pass by? He smiled, a hint of his former mischief returning. Let's just say I've found that bench to be an excellent observation point over the years, though you're the first person who's ever suggested I needed a warmer place to stay. That weekend, Ms. Abernathy drove Ellie to an address in Hawthorne Hills, an elegant neighborhood of large homes set back from tree-lined streets. Mr. Harrington's residence proved to be a beautiful stone house, not ostentatious but undeniably impressive, with a circular driveway and meticulously maintained gardens. I've never been here before, Ms. Abernathy admitted as they approached the front door. He's quite private about his personal life. The door opened before they could ring the bell, revealing a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked dark hair and kind eyes. You must be Ellie, she said warmly. I'm Mrs. Foster, Mr. Harrington's housekeeper. He's waiting for you in the library. The interior of the house matched its exterior, elegant but comfortable, with warm colors and well-worn leather furniture amid the obvious quality of everything from the oriental rugs to the art on the walls. Mrs. Foster led them through a central hallway to a room that made Ellie catch her breath, a 2-story library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves accessible by a rolling ladder, comfortable reading chairs arranged near a stone fireplace, and tall windows overlooking a private garden. Mr. Harrington rose from one of the chairs as they entered. Welcome to my home, he said simply. The tour that followed revealed a house that was far more home than showplace. While undeniably luxurious, each room felt lived in and personal. Family photographs lined the hallways, Mr. Harrington with his late wife, at various foundation events, receiving awards. One entire wall featured framed children's artwork. From scholarship students over the years, he explained when he caught Ellie studying them, some of whom are now doctors, teachers, engineers. The room that would be hers, if she accepted his offer, was on the second floor, spacious and bright, with a window seat overlooking the garden and an adjoining bathroom. Someone, Mrs. Foster presumably, had placed a vase of fresh flowers on the dresser. You could decorate it however you like, Mr. Harrington said as Ellie explored the space. Make it your own. By the time they returned downstairs for tea in the sunroom, Ellie's head was spinning with possibilities. Ms. Abernathy and Mr. Harrington discussed the upcoming end-of-year school events while Ellie tried to organize her thoughts. May I ask you something? She said suddenly during a lull in their conversation. Of course, Mr. Harrington replied. Why were you really on that bench that day? In old clothes, pretending to be... She hesitated, not wanting to use the word beggar again. He considered her question thoughtfully. When I was first building the foundation, I would visit schools unannounced, sit in classrooms, observe interactions, get a feel for the culture. But as my name became more recognized, that became difficult. People behave differently when they know who's watching. He stirred his tea absently. So I developed alternatives. The maintenance worker checking hallways during class changes. The substitute teacher. And occasionally the old man on the bench. A slight smile crossed his face. You'd be surprised what you learn when people think you're invisible. The parallel to Ellie's own experience, her years of invisibility at school, wasn't lost on her. And what did you learn about Maple Grove? Many things, both encouraging and concerning. His expression grew more serious. I learned that some students, like Aiden Phillips, believe wealth entitles them to mistreat others, that some teachers see only grades rather than the children behind them. But I also learned that there are students with extraordinary capacity for kindness, even when they have every reason to protect what little they have for themselves. His gaze met hers directly. You reminded me why I started the foundation, Ellie. Not just to provide educational opportunities, but to nurture the kind of character that will truly change the world. On the drive back to campus, Ellie was uncharacteristically quiet, processing everything she'd seen and heard. It's a big decision, Ms. Abernathy said gently. No one expects you to make it immediately. Did you know he was going to offer to be my guardian? Ellie asked. The teacher shook her head. Not specifically, though I'm not entirely surprised. He's spoken very highly of you in faculty meetings. What would you do? If you were me? Ms. Abernathy considered the question seriously. I think I'd consider whether this arrangement would bring stability and support to my life, and whether I felt comfortable with Mr. Harrington in that role. Guardian is different from mentor. It's more personal, more permanent. He said I reminded him of who he wishes he'd been at my age. Ellie mused. But I think maybe he was exactly like me, just without anyone to share their lunch. The following Monday, Ellie requested a meeting with Mr. Harrington. They met in the garden, sitting once again on the bench where their story had begun. I've thought about your offer, she began, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, and I have some questions. I expected you might. His expression was open, patient. Ask anything you wish. Would I call you Mr. Harrington? Or, she trailed off, uncertain how to phrase the alternative. Whatever you're comfortable with, he replied, though perhaps Robert might be a reasonable middle ground between formality and familiarity, at least to start. Ellie nodded, considering. And school? Would everyone know you're my guardian? That would be public record eventually, but we could be discreet about it initially, allow you time to adjust without the added attention. She took a deep breath. One more question. Why me? Really? There must be hundreds of orphans at better schools than Greenwood who could use a guardian. Mr. Harrington was quiet for a long moment, gazing out at the garden. When he finally spoke, his voice held a depth of emotion she hadn't heard before. When I was 11, a year after losing my parents, I was placed with a foster family who seemed perfect on paper. Nice house, good neighborhood, regular church attendance. But the father was, he paused, choosing his words carefully, controlling. Abusive, though, in ways that didn't leave visible marks. Ellie listened silently, understanding instinctively that this was something he rarely shared. One day at school, I was so hungry I nearly passed out in gym class. I hadn't been allowed breakfast as punishment for some minor infraction. The school nurse gave me crackers, and I hid half to take home for later. He turned to look at Ellie directly. On the way home, I saw an old woman sitting on a park bench. She looked as hungry as I felt, and I walked right past her, clutching those crackers in my pocket. The admission hung in the air between them. I've regretted that moment for 50 years, he continued quietly. Not because sharing crackers would have changed that woman's life significantly, but because in that moment I allowed fear to override compassion. I allowed my own pain to justify ignoring someone else's. He smiled slightly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. And then, half a century later, a young girl with every reason to protect what little she had chose differently. She saw someone in need and responded with generosity, despite her own hunger. Ellie felt heat rise to her cheeks. It was just half a sandwich. It was a choice. The kind that reveals character. Mr. Harrington's voice was gentle but firm. As for why you specifically, because I believe in investing in people who will pay it forward. People who understand that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in how much better we leave the world than we found it. Ellie let his words sink in, feeling their weight and truth. After a long moment, she straightened her shoulders and met his gaze directly. I'd like to accept your offer, she said simply. I'd like you to be my guardian. The smile that spread across Mr. Harrington's face held genuine joy. I was hoping you'd say that. In the months that followed, Ellie's world expanded in ways she could never have imagined that November day when she'd shared her lunch with a stranger. The legal process of guardianship proceeded smoothly, with Mr. Harrington, Robert, as she was learning to call him, ensuring every requirement was met with meticulous attention. The transition wasn't without challenges. There were awkward moments as they learned to navigate their new relationship, occasional misunderstandings as boundaries were established, and the inevitable adjustment period as Ellie grew accustomed to having someone genuinely invested in her daily life. But there were far more moments of unexpected joy: weekend trips to museums and botanical gardens, dinner conversations that stretched late into the evening, the simple security of knowing that someone would notice if she was sad or tired or excited about a good grade. The school year ended with Ellie achieving highest honors and receiving the Foundation's Award for Artistic Promise, presented with beautifully concealed pride by Robert himself in his official capacity as Foundation Director. As summer arrived, Ellie moved her belongings from the small apartment to the room that was now officially hers in Robert's home. Mrs. Foster helped her decorate it to her preferences, and by July it felt truly her own, the first real bedroom she'd had since her parents' death. On a warm evening in late July, as they sat on the terrace watching fireflies rise from the garden, Robert handed Ellie a slender wrapped package. "A belated birthday gift," he explained. "Something I should have given you sooner." Inside was a silver picture frame containing a photograph Ellie had never seen. Her parents on what appeared to be a hiking trail, laughing at the camera, her mother's arm around her father's waist. "How did you—" she began, her fingers tracing their faces through the glass. "The Foundation has resources," Robert said simply. "I thought you should have it." Tears filled Ellie's eyes, not the desperate, hopeless tears of grief she'd known in the early days after losing them, but a softer, gentler emotion: gratitude for what she'd had, acknowledgement of what she'd lost, appreciation for what she'd found. "Thank you," she whispered, holding the frame against her heart. Robert's hand rested briefly on her shoulder, a gesture that had become familiar and comforting over the months. "They would be proud of the young woman you're becoming, Ellie." "I certainly am." As darkness deepened and the fireflies multiplied, Ellie thought about the long, winding path that had led her here, from isolated orphan to cherished ward, from invisible student to recognized artist, from hunger to abundance in all the ways that truly mattered. And it had all begun with half a sandwich, freely given despite her own hunger. A small act of kindness that had opened a door she never knew existed. The next morning, Robert found her in the kitchen, packing 2 lunches instead of 1. "Planning a picnic?" he asked, accepting the coffee Mrs. Foster handed him. "Actually," Ellie replied, carefully wrapping homemade sandwiches, "I thought we might visit the children's home today. The summer volunteers are always overwhelmed, and I remember how boring Saturdays could be." She glanced up at him uncertainly. Would that be okay? The pride in Robert's eyes was answer enough, but he nodded and said, "I think that would be more than okay. It would be perfect." As they drove toward Greenwood Home for Children, lunch bags and art supplies packed in the back seat, Ellie gazed out the window at the summer landscape rushing past. She thought about the cycles of giving and receiving, of loss and finding, that seemed to shape the most meaningful parts of life. An orphan had shared her lunch with a beggar, and he had turned out to be so much more than appearances suggested. But then so had she. And perhaps that was the most valuable lesson of all, that acts of kindness revealed the true nature of both giver and receiver, and in that revelation, lives could be transformed in ways no one could predict. "One sandwich at a time,"